common concept that I find students have problems with is distinguishing the difference between variation and variety. Failing to understand these differences can result in decisions that can be detrimental to the supply chain. Take, for instance, General Motors. General Motors during the 80s and 90s embarked on a automation scheme to increase capacity of their factories. Unfortunately, although they were able to increase the capacity, they did not address variety within their manufacturing and the supply chain. As a result, they had a large capacity, which was able to help address variation to some extent, but they were not able to apply this capacity to their large variety of different product models. And as a result, after the financial collapse, General Motors was forced with reducing the number of product lines. This occurred because their goal of increasing capacity did not address increasing the variety of the capacity. Therefore, their capacity was very limited in the ability to address variety. So what do we mean when we talk about variety? Variety in general talks about the different types of products within a supply chain. Let's take, for instance, if we have one product type, let's say we're making cars, and we have one model, and we decided we want to provide two other types of models. We've just increased the variety from 1 to 3. Now this can be very detrimental to a supply chain, because if the supply chain is not designed correctly, you may be forced to have 3 different product lines, which can be very complex, very costly, and it's also very risky because you've just increased the number of potential failure points within your supply chain system. When we deal with variation, we deal with differences between outputs of a process. So for instance, in this example, if we have a supplier that provides 100 widgets to manufacturing, the variation between each of the different types of widgets is what we deal with variation. Like, let's say if a specification for widget is 10 inches plus or minus 1 inch, we deal with how those products fall within that range as the variation inherent within the supply chain. I have a video discussing variation in more, which you can watch in more detail to understand variation. So I'm not going to deal with how we define and identify variation in this video, but just rest assured that when we deal with variation, we deal with differences between the same product and a process output, whereas variety deals with different types of products within a supply chain. So how can we deal with variety? There are 2 main ways that we deal with variety. First, we increase the ability of the supply chain to absorb variety, and we do this by making the supply chain more flexible. For example, in this graphic, we can create it such that the supplier is able to create a modular component in which the differentiation between the models can be applied later in the supply chain. So in theory, the further down we can create this modularity, the more simplified the supply chain is and the more variety we absorb. So we increase the ability of each of these elements to absorb variety by increasing the variety within that element, which goes to Ashby's first law of systems, which basically says that only variety can absorb variety. Now, the other way that we can address variety is basically to just only provide a certain number of products for a customer. If, for example, you have customers, you have a large demand for 3 products, but yet you're not able to produce those 3 products effectively, you may make a decision to basically only provide 1 product or maybe 2 products, whatever you find your supply chain can handle. This is how a decision making within the supply chain can be used to limit the amount of variety that enters into the supply chain. Now note, I don't go into this into much detail, but when we have a product support function, which basically is a type of service supply chain, It's outside the scope of this video, but it's different in services in that service supply chains usually deal with intangible products, whereas this service supply chain has a tangible product, which basically deals with failures of a supply chain to provide the correct product to the customer. In this instance, the variation caused by the product as it is used by the customer results in variety. Basically, the variety is the number of failures that we can have. For example, we may have multiple failures of it's the wrong kind of car, it's the wrong color of car. See, each of these is a different sort of failure, which increases the variety of the product support function to absorb it. So in this regard, the variation created by the supply chain, as it is, in this case, the variation that ends up at the customer and that the customer absorbs through having to accept a flawed part or a flawed product or a product that doesn't meet their demands, results in a type of failure, which is a sort of variety. So when we deal with product support functions, once again, this is outside the scope of this video, but when we deal with product support functions, we have to deal with the product support's ability to absorb variation as it is defined by the number of potential failures faced by a customer. I hope that this video was very helpful in helping you understand the difference between variation and variety. Please feel free to leave comments in the video if you have any questions. If you like the video, please press like. And if you like the videos in this series, please feel free to subscribe to stay informed of any future videos.